All right, folks. Well, we are here live to talk about what leaders can do to turn conflict into fuel. We talk about conflict management. Some people are saying, there's too much conflict on my team. I want to stop all the drama. And I'm all the way for stopping the drama. I'm not necessarily for stopping the conflict. Conflict is right? And in fact, conflict is really helpful if you use it right. So we're going to talk about turning conflict into fuel for your team, fuel for your business, and the most insidious form of conflict that I find in talking with leaders in companies of all kinds is it's the stuff that gets leaders pulling their hair out and crying in their coffee. It's us versus them conflict. And usually when they're pulling their hair out, they're talking about us versus them conflict that's internal. Maybe it's the top brass versus the folks on the front lines and all the folks in middle management who are playing both sides. Kind of a two-faced dance of trying to keep the peace with everybody, and not having the skills to deal with that. Maybe us versus them is the sales versus production, that old chestnut, or sales versus marketing, another one that we're really familiar with. Less often, though still commonly, I hear about us versus them is, say, on a consulting in a consulting company. It's the consultants, the implementers from the consulting company versus the implementation team on the client company, and there's struggle and conflict there. So us versus them, very, very big deal and very destructive for a lot of companies and a lot of teams. And we'll talk more about us versus them later. I promised you 3 things that you as a leader can do to help curb the destructive forms of conflict and get back into a more productive form of conflict on your team. And a couple of weeks ago, I did a video like this that got a lot of comments and a lot of appreciation, essentially saying there are 3 different kinds of conflict culture. As we've already talked about, conflict it just exists. There's nothing you can do to prevent conflict. You can prevent the destructive stuff. There's the conflict free or conflict avoidant cultures, and those are very dangerous and, in my experience, very, very common. Then there's the culture of argument, where people are butting heads, where uh, there's struggle around whose ideas are best and whose way is going to win and who's going to get credit and things like that. There's this culture of argument, right? With what we might think of as a culture of conflict. And then there's the culture of debate. And that's the one that I think of as being healthy. So the 3 things that I'm going to suggest that you can do today are all things that will help you move from whatever kind of culture you have, deeper and deeper into that culture of debate and culture of action. So the first suggestion that I have is to surface the inhibited conflict that already exists in your company, to surface the hidden conflict, the stuff that's just there under the surface, the stuff that's leading people to smile and seethe, perhaps. I was talking with a CEO. There are 2 different CEOs that I was talking with just this week. One of them was saying that he himself had really kind of fallen down on the job in a way. He was very frustrated with the leaders on his team. They hadn't been taking initiative. They hadn't been driving the initiatives themselves. They hadn't been solving their own problems. And instead of finding ways to gently but firmly insist that they take up the mantle of leadership to meet his expectations, he had found that he was stepping in and doing their work for them. And in his words, not really playing the role of CEO, but instead playing the role of kind of getting crap done. And so uh, he had the incredible courage to apologize to his team for not insisting that they step up into the role that he imagined for them and that he wanted to see from them. And in fact, he's looking to hear from them about what they are or are not committed to in the very near future. And we'll see. I will tell you this, that change from this CEO is going to create significant change in his organization, significant change to what they're able to do, what they're able to accomplish. And so he has surfaced some of this conflict that has been lurking in his own mind and making him uh, kind of smile and seethe through the months that this has, or years maybe, that this has been going on. Another CEO that I was talking to just this week uh, has also acknowledged, yeah, I've been permitting the unacceptable. I've been accepting the unacceptable in my organization. She said there were some pretty nasty words flying back and forth between some of the people on her team because treating people poorly had been accepted. People committing fireable offenses didn't lead to firing. And the folks in HR, they don't have the appetite in this service-based organization to pull the trigger on real action. They're deep in empathy and light on what I think of as compassion. And so she is having to step up, step forward, and require from her leaders, require from human resources that when people do the unacceptable, that there are swift and immediate actual consequences to the unacceptable. And so she is now taking up the mantle of surfacing some of this conflict and saying, we must deal with this conflict. We can no longer pretend that it isn't here, or pretend that it isn't impactful, or pretend that it doesn't have consequences. What both of these leaders are doing is they really are embracing reality at a whole new level. And I would say that's probably going to be a theme that we can carry through the entirety of our time together on this topic, is that conflict turns into fuel when we embrace reality. We embrace the reality that people are perhaps not doing what they say they're going to do, or what they've committed to doing. The reality that people are behaving in ways that are not acceptable. And what happens often with particularly middle manager leaders is that they'll look at the microcosm of that and not at the macrocosm. In other words, if I treat my colleague poorly, if I say things that are unacceptable, if I curse them out, then we might think of that as an issue just between the two of us. And in fact, in this organization, HR was thinking of it as an issue between them. And we really need to give this one person who really stepped out of bounds, we need to give them the opportunity to understand the implications of what they've done and so on. And they're really kind of pussyfooting around the issue. What they didn't do, and what the CEO has decided she must do, is to look at what are the implications for the entire organization. This is an organization of hundreds of people. If there aren't consequences for abusive attack, for really abusive conversation with your colleagues, if there aren't immediate and swift consequences for that, then what are the implications for everyone else in the organization? I remember there's a story in my family. When I was 10 months old, I was put in front of the lion's cage at the zoo, and there I was sitting in the sun. And the lion took great interest in me and strode forward and paced just back and forth. eyes intent on me as if to say, "Oh, that could be lunch." The reasons that my parents didn't flip out about this peak predator, mere feet from their infant child. The reason that they did not become frightened about that is that there was a fence, a very reliable barrier between me and the predator. And so if you're not creating those boundaries, and if those boundaries aren't meaningful and real, then people are not going to feel safe. So that's one way of thinking about surfacing the hidden conflict, is to embrace reality. Another way to embrace reality and surface the hidden conflict, very often we will, as leaders, will ask for something in a meeting. We'll say something to the effect of, "This is what I'd like from you all," and people have a tendency, when you're the leader, to smile and nod, even to say, maybe "Great idea, boss." Uh, and what's true is that's not always really what they think. They may think, "Oh, this is not going to go well," or they may think, "I'm not comfortable with this." And I'm not suggesting that you back down from your position necessarily, but when people are having those thoughts, very often we can see those thoughts play across their face, right? They might look down and almost imperceptibly shake their head, either in disagreement, or maybe they're just kind of struggling to see how that could work or how they can fit it into their calendar. And so it's important to surface that hidden conflict. Say, "Bob, I noticed, seems like maybe there's something uncomfortable about this for you." Um, Very often we may pick up on very subtle hints that Janet and Bob they're not entirely comfortable with one another in some way. Bob has said something and Janet's now kind of looking at him funny. It's important to be able to not just gloss over these things and figure, well, if it's important, they'll work it out. But to say, it seems as though there's some friction here. You don't want to necessarily do that publicly, right? But to talk to Bob at some point, say, "Bob, it seems like maybe there's some friction between you and Janet." Talk with Janet. "Janet, seems like maybe there's some friction between you and Bob. What can you tell me about that?" It's so easy for us as leaders to figure, well, if as long as people are saying they'll do it, or as long as they're keeping a lid on it, everything's going to be fine, right? I'm getting what I need here. And in my experience, across now 80, probably 80 plus teams over the course of the last decade, when we go along to get along, when we see the commitment we need, even if we're seeing the signs of internal struggle, when we do that, what we're delaying the inevitable, and it may feel like a price. It certainly slows things down right now to say, "Gary, it seems like maybe you're concerned that this isn't going to work," or uh, "Sue, it seems like maybe you're not entirely on board yet." It seems like it's going to slow things down, and it does right now. But what I can promise you, after years of doing this with so many teams, is that it really greases the skids for later on. You can surface problems that maybe you hadn't necessarily anticipated and figure out how to address them before they bite you in the butt. You can really get Sue on board, where before maybe she was planning to, or maybe not even planning to, but was set up to drag her feet. When you address Bob and Janet and the friction between them, it Boy, does that take time, right? Maybe you've got to have a conversation with them and take them away from their desks, and it sure seems to slow things down. Not as much as the explosion that may be in the offing. So, surface surface that hidden conflict. It's there in every team, no matter how small, no matter how healthy. There is hidden, there is underground, there is inhibited conflict because, for the most part, we're peace loving creatures. And we will try to keep the peace. Even your most argumentative people, at some points, are trying to keep the peace. I remember working with a team recently where somebody, under their breath, uh, when they were talking about some failure to deliver, said, he, under his breath, said, well, if certain people would just do their jobs. And the reason that it was under his breath is he was trying to keep the peace. Now, of course, that's a toxic way to say it. And in fact, it came out in some ways in that toxic fashion because they hadn't surfaced this conflict before and brought it into the light in order to have it be dealt with. All right. Enough about surfacing the inhibited conflict. That's the first thing that I'm suggesting that you can do to help turn conflict into fuel. The second thing, skill up every single person in your organization at a very particular skill. The skill of disagreeing without being disagreeable. Right? How do you create an environment where ideas compete and people are harmonious? And part of one of the most important skills for that is to have people be skilled at communicating. And one of the great soft skills of communication is the ability to disagree without being disagreeable, to, with an impassioned fervor, speak for your position, talk about what you believe in, share your thoughts and your insights about what's going on in the company and how best you can achieve target A, all with great fervor, even if it disagrees with what your colleague is saying, in a way that doesn't leave your colleague feeling as though you are attacking them personally, in a way that really recognizes the contribution of their thoughts and their ideas and their perspective, even at the same time as you disagree with the conclusions that they've drawn, or with the actions that they've taken, or with the plans that they are making. It is entirely possible to disagree with incredible fervor without being disagreeable. And the teams that we find are the most functional, that solve problems the fastest, that surface potential threats the most readily, that hang together and don't fall into distraction, are the teams where people are the most skilled at disagreeing without being disagreeable. And this is something that we train teams to do with great effectiveness. In fact, we're going to be working next month with a team that we worked with about 7 years ago for one morning. We spent the morning with them, and they said, we are still using the tools that you gave us to disagree without being disagreeable. And it's been incredibly effective for me as a leader, one of the people said. And that's why they're bringing us back. They have grown by 50% in the last few years. They want everybody to have some of these skills, and they're looking to keep their culture nice and tight as they are scaling. They've been growing, and the growth is about to, and has begun, in fact, to pick up the pace. So they're growing faster, and they want everybody to have these skills to conflict in that culture of debate that we talked about at the very beginning of this video, the culture of debate rather than the culture of argument. Right now, they don't have a culture of argument. They've more got a culture of avoidance, a conflict-free culture which is exacerbated by the fact that they are remote. And so the fact that they're remote means that they are going along to get along much more often than would be useful for them. And then that those avoided conflicts then come back to hit them. And it's especially when conflicts have been avoided and the heat rises, the pressure has been rising. It's especially important in those moments when it's so easy to become heated, to become potentially personal, to get aggressive or rough or incendiary. It's especially important in those moments to have these skills to disagree without being disagreeable, and to argue fervently for your position without making the other person feel wrong or wronged or belittled or attacked. Many years ago now, Google did research about what are the teams that are the most productive. They get the most done, they solve problems the fastest, they innovate the best. What are the teams that are most effective characterized by? And the number one answer that they came to across this giant of an organization, looking at so very many teams, was that the teams that are effective are the teams where there is psychological safety. And it may not surprise you that teams that surface conflicts early in a respectful fashion, that make sure to handle conflicts before they turn into horrible boils, and the teams where people are able to disagree without being disagreeable, those are the teams where there's the greatest psychological safety, the ability to be me, the ability to say things that I think may be hard for you to hear without concern that I'm going to have to pay a price for that. That's what psychological safety is. And these are some of the things that lead to psychological safety. So thing one, my first suggestion about turning conflict into fuel was to surface conflict that may be hidden or inhibited. The second one is to make sure that everybody on your team has the skills to disagree without being disagreeable. And the third thing, I promised I'd come back to us versus them. So the third suggestion that I have about how to turn conflict into fuel, and again, right, we're coming to, I told you there was going to be a theme throughout this whole thing of embrace reality. And part of the reality of humans is the way our brains are structured, and our brains are structured for us versus them. That's just a part of the way our brains are hardwired. It's part of our mammalian nature, our tribal nature. Think about, I just this week suggested to person one that he might want to meet person two, and I sent him person two's LinkedIn. And he said, aside from his being a Hoosier, this looks like somebody I would want to meet, right? So his very first inkling, his very first response was, this guy is them. And then he was able to turn that into a joke. And yet, that's part of his neurobiology, is that we are tribal creatures. I have neighbors here in the Seattle area who every Christmas they put up Seattle Seahawks colored lights. They're signaling we are one of them. We are 12, right? That is an us. And what happens very often in organizations where they try to struggle against the us versus them contingents that may be emerging inside their organizations is that it backfires, because we can never fight human nature. We can never fight the neurological wiring and win. We just can't. That's not how neurological wiring works. And so how do you embrace reality and turn this us versus them wiring that we have into fuel for your organization, well, you've got to identify a them. For sports teams, this is pretty easy, right? If we're the Cowboys, then them is the Commanders. You can see me struggling. I'm not really a sports guy. Sports teams know who their rival is. Schools, very often, right? No, they know who the rival is. In business, the easy one is to pick your nearest competitor and make the competitor the them. And if you've got the us versus them in people's brains aligned already, if you give that us versus them brain something to do, then it has something to do. If you don't give it something to do, it will find something to do, and it might find internal conflict. It might find an internal them to turn against. And so you've got to give it an external them. It might be your competition. That's one way. A more sophisticated way, we're working with an electrical repair company. And in order to really have an effective them, you've also got to have lofty goals and a really wonderful mission. Simon Sinek talks about the why, right? Start with why. If you have a why, this electrical repair company that we're working with, their mission essentially is to use their expertise to make their clients' homes more comfortable, more convenient, and most importantly, safer. And so what's the them? Well, they've decided not to fight against the competition as them. Their adversary is the fact that many people have been abandoned to bad wiring and potential future house fires. And so people are coming to work to fight future house fires. Now, that is an adversary worth my time and attention. And so my us versus them part of my brain goes to this adversary, the future house fires. We can even, and we're still me. I hope you can hear me. So Domino's Pizza, back when I was in high school, they created the Noid, right? It's this fictional creature that was constantly trying to sabotage people's pizza delivery. And Domino's positioned itself as a company that knew how to defeat the Noid, defeat this fictional character that would have your pizza delivered cold and upside down and with the cheese all over the box, right? You can invent an adversary that is a concept. You can invent an adversary that's what your customer struggles with and would be really disappointed by. And when you give the us versus them, the tribal component of our natural wiring something to do, then it has something to do. And if you superpower that with a mission that is worth getting out of bed for in the morning, well, then the us versus them in your organization, particularly if you couple it with the two other things that we've talked about today, the us versus them inside your organization is almost sure to evaporate. How do you make a really compelling mission that's worth getting out of bed for in the morning? That's a subject for another video, or we've already got a blog article on the yesworks.com that is right down the alley for that. I'd be happy to share it with you. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm Aaron Schmuckler, CEO, co-founder at the YesWorks, company culture engineer. We are the go-to guides for developing the kind of culture where people and business thrive, where people are doing the best work of their lives so that your business thrives and they go home every day feeling fulfilled and rewarded for the work that they're doing. I'm Aaron Schmuckler, and thank you for hanging out with me for the last half hour. Back to it.